Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. I know the 9 o'clock start time is a little difficult, and we appreciate everyone being here and getting through security and coming to our session. So I'm Karen McCabe. I'm with IEEE, and today we have a great panel to talk about Internet inclusions shaping the digital future. We know that there's so many great opportunities and work underway and how we can accelerate progress to connect those who are unconnected and underserved. But today we also want to have a discussion not just about the challenges. We really want to have a roll up the sleeves a discussion, push the envelope a little bit about, from your experiences and our panel experience, you'll hear today of, what's working, what may not be working. They're all working in amazing spaces, doing amazing things, and have a lot to share to help see how we can, progress advancing solutions for the unconnected. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Deepak Masharari, who's also the IEEE Internet Initiative Vice Chair of the IEEE. With us, we have Jane Coffin from ISOC, Adrian Lovett from the Web Foundation, Samar Baba from IEEE Site, and Christopher Yu from the University of Pennsylvania. So with that, I'll hand it over. Oops, I'm sorry. I wanted to do a little bit of a warm-up to get everyone kind of an icebreaker to get us thinking in a positive way. So fast forward, and we want to do a little bit of a rapid fire and just kind of shout out what you think. But one word that describes Internet access 10 years from now. Everybody. Universal.
I think it's invisible.
Participation.
We can go around the room because there's not that many of us.
Openness. Easy.
So let's hear from the panelists. One word.
Well, can I have two? Because I think there's two routes here. So I would say essential as one, but perhaps provocatively I would say broken, if I can put a question mark after it.
Dynamic.
Okay. Well, with that, I'll hand it over to Deepak to get into the dialogue.
Thanks, Karen, and good morning, everybody. I know it's the view from the window outside is perhaps better, but still, thanks to all of you for being here. When we are looking at Internet inclusion, it can have multiple dimensions and multiple ways of looking at things. So, for example, somebody in a developed country may look at Internet inclusion, whether everybody has access or not, in terms of having on a smartphone or maybe even having a home PC, whereas a village in India or in Africa, people may still be thinking about having some sort of kiosk, maybe running 2 hours or 4 hours a day on some level of electricity with some poor level of connectivity, and is it still available or not available? So the dimensions can vary a lot between different locations and different perspectives. But then we just had an event about 2.5 months back in India, in Delhi, on the similar theme, Internet inclusion and advancing solutions. And through the workshop there that day, the participants came up with a 5A framework. And I just want to touch upon those words a little bit. One was about awareness. Are people aware about the Internet, what it can do, what it cannot do, things like that. Availability, so which is basically about having availability of the services and devices. Affordability of services and devices, I mean what price points those things are available. So maybe $1,000 phone doesn't seem too much for some people. At the same time, for some people, even paying a $1 a month for a service may be just too much. And then accessibility, and when we are looking at accessibility, it's not just about physical or those aspects of accessibility. It's also about accessibility in terms of language and gender and other aspects of that. And also assurance, which is about how do people have trust in the system, in the ecosystem, in terms of security, privacy, safety, protection, everything, and resilience. So with that, let's start with the discussion today. Karen has already introduced all the panelists. My request would be for each of them to make about 2 minutes on each of these topics. So we'll go like these things in phases. So initially we'll do availability and awareness, these two things. So I would request you to speak for about 2 minutes each, and then of course we'll have comments and questions from all those who are present here. So you can start with Chris. You?
So in terms of availability, the project that I'm working on, One World Connected at the University of Pennsylvania, is very much dedicated to this idea. What we did cataloged is 750 innovative ways people are attempting to connect people to the internet. What we discovered is there's a complete lack of empirical information about what's working and what isn't. And we find that ministers who are faced with the obligation of connecting their people are being bombarded with different people offering different solutions, and they don't really have any traction on being able to find out what actually works. Second, there's only half the 7 billion world citizens online. What we're discovering is a lot of the models that are being supported right now are being done on grant or corporate social responsibility money, and they do not have scalable models. They actually have no revenue whatsoever, and when the grant money runs out, they have no ability to continue to operate. And so what's created is a new emphasis in terms of creating accessibility. It's not just getting people connected, it's keeping them connected. And that becomes a very different problem. What we're discovering is that, in fact, to get to 3.5 billion, it's not one solution, it's going to be different solutions for urban, rural, mountainous, island, different types of areas. And that we need to find, where possible, the ability to harness private company investment, because public investment is not going to get us all the way there, and charitable investment isn't going to get us all the way there. To try to find that right balance where it's available, and to try to find ways that scale and sustain. Last thought. The questions you gave us in advance said, beyond accessibility and availability, is it enough to deploy? There's an old line from a movie. They say, if you build it, they will come. We've discovered that's simply not true. That if you measure the barriers to adoption, it includes things such as digital literacy, and shockingly to the people who are here at the Internet Governance Forum is relevance. Why do they need it? And you discover this is robust across developing and developed societies. India, China, Brazil, all the surveys have found the same thing. And so even if you build cheap, ubiquitous networks, if you don't attend to giving people the digital literacy training and showing them the relevance of it, we still won't accomplish the goals that all of us here are committed to. And that's why we're trying to do validation on the demand side as well as the supply side, to lay the empirical base that the finance community needs to decide how to make investments, that governments need learn how to make investments, and to actually make this on a scale, to achieve the goal that we've all set for connecting 1.5 billion more people by the year 2020.
Thanks, Chris. Adrian?
Well, thanks, Deepak. I think if the question is around what does internet access really mean, I mean, first I agree completely with Chris. If you build it, they won't necessarily come, or they may come and then go, or they may come and not really get into the game. So I absolutely agree. That's a central insight to help frame this discussion. I do think maybe at this point it's worth taking a step back, even in this room of extremely well-versed colleagues, because internet access actually, of course, does mean so much, and it's worth, I think, banking that as we go into this discussion. Otherwise, why do we care about ensuring that everyone has that access? And the fact that today, we're at this kind of, in the next year, this 50-50 moment where we will finally pass that mark of half the world having access to the web, access to the internet for the first time, gives us a moment for pause and to recognize the extraordinary benefits that have arisen from that, whether economic, whether people being able to create businesses, to earn a living, build a livelihood, whether more social benefits, political opportunities for people to engage and connect and organize together, which is so crucial to our democracies around the world, the chance for people to meet the love of their life. Everything has been possible, many things have been possible through internet access for those who have had it. And even, a week ago I was in a village called Girisuko in Indonesia, about an hour and a half out from Yogyakarta, where, as people will know, there's been a cyclone that has gone through that part of the world in the last couple of weeks. And the place that people in the village who I was talking to were going to find out information about how the bridge a few kilometers away had been damaged and how long it was going to take to be fixed, and that was a key route to market and school and so on. The place they were going was to the village information portal, which is a website. And they were also, of course, in touch with their friends on WhatsApp and Facebook as well, and finding out what was happening in other parts of the district. And actually, at the same time as I was there, I noticed that Google issued its top 10 search terms of 2017. And, of course, there was stuff in there like the fidget spinner and so on, which is all great. But actually, the number one search term globally this year was Hurricane Irma. And people were not searching Hurricane Irma for fun. They were, unlikely anyway, they were doing it for all sorts of very important reasons. So internet access, absolutely central, and I guess that's why it's great that we're talking about, in our view at the Web Foundation, the absolute imperative that we push on from that 50-50 mark and get not just the next billion, but that we design our approaches from here on to ensure that the web and the internet really are for everyone as they were intended to be.
Thanks. Okay. Samar? And the side project that you're doing?
Okay. First of all, I want to talk about the availability of internet, for example, because you can find countries suffering from addiction from internet, like Japan, the US, etc., and countries like mine, Tunisia, suffering from a lack of accessibility of internet, even into schools. And that comes our project Tawasul with the IEEE site. We are trying to provide internet access to schools in rural areas. For example, in my country, only 40% of the schools and universities have internet access. So it's really important to talk about availability because it can really be a mean of creating opportunity of jobs and connecting, and it's really essential now. About the awareness, yes, we can talk here about security and training, for example, kids and users about the inconvenience of getting addicted from using internet and the cybersecurity, for example, etc. So yes, I think that internet access is essential and everyone has to have internet access nowadays. Yeah.
Thanks, Samar. So, Jane, ISOC has been doing this thing, and recently, of course, the anniversary. So, congratulations for that. That's eligibility. And what's been the ISOC experience in this space?
Thank you very much. I work for the Internet Society. If you don't know that organization, as Deepak said, we're 25 years old today. Our mission is an affordable, available, open, accessible internet, and it should be for everyone. And I think Mei Lin is going to appreciate the next word I'm going to say is that it's about people. We've had chapters around the world who work from the bottom up, who are on the ground. So I call this the local issues. You can't come in to a local village. Adrian was just in a village in Indonesia. You can't go in and say, we really know what's good for you. There are so many old aid projects that have come in around the world where people thought they knew what people needed. Unless you ask people what they need and work with them from the local level, you'll never make a sustainable infrastructure stay. You won't get that scale that you need because there's no one invested at that personal level. I'm going to say 4 things very briefly about that question you had with respect to availability and awareness. 1, if we want more available architecture, infrastructure, technical infrastructure, we have to change the way we do policy and regulatory inclusion and change those policies. The old communications policies from a telecom perspective will not help scale what we need from the internet inclusion perspective, infrastructure itself. And I've been a regulator, so I know this, and I've been in a ministry. People have to be allowed to be involved in that process. Sometimes it's just regulators and policymakers talking to each other. That doesn't help if you don't know what's needed at the local level. Funding vehicles, The massive funding vehicles that come in the $2 billion, $10 million range, well, those are laudable for many big infrastructure projects. That doesn't work at the local level. We've helped build internet exchange points and community networks for as little as $10,000. So we need to figure out, as Christopher's saying, though, how to move from the volunteer-funded model to the business model at that level. So it's also an awareness on the ground of what the local customs are from an indigenous perspective for those communities that are highly marginalized. It's a very different ecosystem, and you have to work with the village elders and the kids to make that stick. And you can't assume you know how that's going to work, because it's more of a collective mentality. And transparency. If there's no transparency in regulatory, financing, how things work on the ground, you will be given certain answers that actually aren't those answers that will help you make the projects work or allow for that sustainability. And from a regulatory perspective, if you don't know where to go to get a license, how much spectrum there is, you can't start your project. You can't get very far.
Or you could also have a situation where, for example, things like Wi-Fi you can't even use.
Exactly.
I mean, forget about license fee, etc. So now at this point of time, I would just like to invite comments or questions, but please be brief in the interest of time. And yeah, anybody? Yeah, please. And could you also introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, my name is Julius Endert. I'm from the Deutsche Welle Academy, the German broadcaster, and we also do media development projects. So my question is, we are talking about digital inclusion and digital participation, but what I have not heard is a definition what inclusion or participation really means. Does somebody of you have a definition? Because we are also working on a project on digital participation, and we try to find ways to measure it on the ground and which factors are to be researched, but we are struggling to find a correct or feasible definition for participation.
Anybody else? Yeah, Greg. Maybe we can try the other mic. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Christopher, two questions. One is, where have you seen, what's been successful at improving the literacy? I mean, how do you know when a community is ready and finally sees a need, or is it something you just have to synchronously teach as part of giving access? I mean, in terms of projects that you've seen that have been successful.
So the results are preliminary. We're just gathering them, but I'm not going to weasel out. I'll give you the preliminary answer. The more outcome functional oriented the training is, the better. So what do I mean? Don't teach people how to use operating systems and Microsoft Word in the abstract. Help them write a resume. Help them put up a website for their business. Help them apply for education online. And also domestic, local trainers, local language content contextualized for their perspective. But the more on the ground, we want to have these general skill packages. We're discovering that immediate impact, making the immediate benefits clearer and making it locally tailored are essential to this, are the hallmarks of successful digital literacy programs.
On the issue of digital participation that you mentioned, I would say that's definitely one of the major challenges that we have. Like on Sunday we had a Day Zero event, and one of the discussion points that we had was that how do you define these things? Let's say the number of, you could say number of connections per 100 people, you could say number of customers per 100 people, you could say number of users, and you could also say number of beneficiaries. Now each of these may differ significantly. So some of this work, I would say, in terms of digital participation, I don't think there's any universally agreed upon definitional framework at this point of time, but different people and different organizations are working on this area, including research like Chris and World Wide Web Foundation and others. Melon, you want to share something?
Well, I think we've got somebody on the panel who's working on the ground. That's Samar Baba. And I would like to see if Samar has a response to Deutsche Welle's question
of
Because,
digital participation?
You know, the question was what is the definition of digital participation in such a way that it could be useful for the funders? So I look at the panel and I see people who are kind of policy and doing it at the broad level, but Sama is the one person who is actually doing it on the ground. And so just from your experience in Tunisia, what makes a difference for people? Why would they want to get onto the internet?
Thank you for your question, Melen. From my experience, using internet is really important for people that don't have resources to develop themselves. For example, by my experience working with Tawasul within IEEE site, we are organizing, for example, workshops for the kids from different ages and to show them how to code using Scratch, for example, how to improve their technical skills. Internet in Tunisia is almost about using Facebook and YouTube and doing some research through Google. So yes, we are really empowering people in Tunisia, and we are trying to connect all the regions. So we are seeing the real impact of digital participation through our workshops and through our work. So yes.
And how are you measuring these things? Is there any framework that you have for measurement of these?
Yes. In fact, we are working with a consultant that works with 100 million healthier lives, and we are trying to work on the measures. For example, we will know that we are doing the right thing, and we are approaching the project in the right terms by having, for example, 24 leaders that can answer all the questions about what we provided from our workshops, and yes.
So these people are easily available for anybody who needs help in terms of accessing, using a device, things like that?
Yes.
Okay, all right, that's good. Yes, Chris?
So I don't mean to speak out of turn in the sense that Malin is absolutely right. We are proud to have Tawasul as one of our case studies. They're doing fantastic work on the ground, and I cannot replace the authentic voice with which they speak. I also have to thank Jane, because ISOC has funded projects around the world, and they've been very generous about giving us access to their project leaders. So we're not the actual project executors, but we have talked directly with 120 of them. And what I would say is, we at the Internet governance community have a certain nearsightedness. We fall in love with the Internet, and the benefits of it are obvious to us. What's funny is if you talk about broader policymaking communities in terms of deliverables of what digital inclusion is, I think we need to get outside that. The communication minister is behind connectivity for its own sake. But if you're going to build broader coalitions in governments, you have to talk about digital inclusion in terms of development goals, such as economic empowerment, financial inclusion, improved healthcare outcomes, improved education. And in the end, we don't get internet connections for their own sake. We get them because of the other things they do for us. So one thing I would like to encourage the internet community to start to think about is to define digital inclusion not just in terms of getting people connected to the network, but in terms of what it'll do for them, because particularly you meet countries where their needs are, and they vary widely. And so by framing it this way, it'll create a slightly different answer in different places, but I think it's much more effective at achieving the goals we have, the shared goals of global connectivity and participation.
Yeah. So for example, in a country like India, we have this program called JAM, which is the Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Project. So Jan Dhan stands for a financial inclusion program where people could have a zero balance account. They are linked to mobile, and they are also linked to digital identity called Aadhaar, which is based on biometrics. So this is a online authenticable identity, and having a trinity of these, that's how it is working much better rather than if it would have been on a standalone basis. So at this point of time, I would just like to move on to the next segment of our discussion. Yeah, you want to have a quick point? Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you, Sébastien Bachelet. I would thought do we really need to decide why they will use and for what they will use internet? The next billion user may use it for some other purposes that what we are thinking about. We need to give them internet connection, full stop. The rest is how we can discuss with them, try to tell them that they could use it for this or that, but at the end of the day, fortunately, if it's an open internet, it will be used for maybe totally other purposes than what it's used today and what it's our thinking. Leave freedom of the next billion users to use it as they want. Thank you.
I think that's absolutely right, that people will figure out some ways to do different things. But as Chris also mentioned, that when we are developing these type of projects on the ground, it is useful to engage with the local community. What are their needs, which may not be directly related to the internet per se, but how is it that we can actually facilitate that and encourage them on that particular aspect. Chris, we just need to move to the next segment now.
Okay, so quick, the barrier is people don't believe it's relevant. So you have to show them one use case to see its relevance. And meeting them where they are is proven to be an essential thing for deploying. The other thing we're finding on the cost side, 55% of the countries sell application-specific plans on feature phones on 2G spectrum. Yeah. I mean, it's very limited, and being everything to everybody is going to, it's easier to bridge into full deployment sometimes by allowing them to focus on things which are most popular in the current environment.
Okay, thanks. So now let's move to affordability and accessibility. Now, affordability, obviously, it's much easier to grasp, but affordability, again, people need to look at what is the cost of device, what is the cost of service, and the service is not just in terms of the service that you pay, let's say in terms of data plan or something like that, but also service as the cost of applications or using a particular service. So, for example, there are places where if you are making an in India, if you are making an online train booking, you have to pay extra. Whereas the fact is, yes, definitely to railways it must be costing less to do it online if people are going online rather than standing in a physical line and being served at a counter. But that's how the structures are. So what are those type of incentives and other things that can be made? And when people are talking of accessibility, one of the challenges that have is one around languages. For I come from a country where we have 22 official languages recognized by our constitution, apart from English. Just for a comparison, in EU, you have got 24 languages. So europa.eu, that's the homepage of EU, you see nothing but 24 language blocks to choose from, and all of them are left to right. Whereas in our situation, we have left to right, right to left, one language, multiple scripts, multiple languages, same script, so multiple complexity around that. And obviously, for some of these languages and scripts, the population size that is using or practicing that particular language is much smaller. So what are the incentives, what are the ways to facilitate that? Then people are looking at accessibility, for example, for people with differently abled people. So people having motor challenges, people having hearing or visual or speech challenges. And if you have a website that times out, let's say within 3 seconds of not taking a particular action, what happens if for a person with a motor disability? Because that person may take a little bit longer to do that. What happens if you are creating a CAPTCHA, which is too difficult for a normal person, leave aside somebody with a visual impairment? And how do we make those things simpler? So on one hand, yes, we need to still ensure assurance of that, yes, you are doing a second factor authentication, but also at the same time make things simpler. And oftentimes people have this thinking that if I am trying to make something more accessible, it will become more costly. But people should also think about something else. Something like a Kindle or other type of e-book readers, they originally started with people with visual challenges because the Braille books were too heavy, and people started looking at that, and that's something which actually helped everybody. So if we have a philosophy of universal design, that's something which could help a lot. So I just want to start with Adrian on this. World Wide Web Consortium has done a lot of things on WCAG 2.0, for example, on accessibility standards and other things. But how do you also see this whole angle about affordability and accessibility? There's always this challenge, and people find this tenuous relationship between these two concepts.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said, Deepak. I think you outlined it very clearly, the set of challenges there. I mean, we start with the affordability question, and many of us in this room and in this discussion are working together as part of the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which seeks to drive down the costs of broadband, bringing together the big tech firms and governments and civil society. And there's been some progress on that in the last year or so, with this notion that we've all put together of 1 for 2, that 1 gigabyte of data should cost no more than 2% of average monthly income. And through the Alliance for Affordable Internet, we've got now a good picture, including just some updated figures a couple of weeks ago, that show how we're doing against that target. And some countries have come now below that level now, that affordability measure, but many, and in particular African countries, are still well above that. So for us, that's the first and most obvious barrier to access is affordability, after the even more obvious kind of technical ability to connect, actually having coverage. But then I think access goes beyond that, and exactly in the ways that you've outlined, Deepak, and this also relates, I think, to the first discussion, doesn't it, about demand? Because if you build it but it doesn't work for everyone, then of course they won't come, because why would they? And here I think that the sorts of things that are being explored in many areas, including how community networks are being particularly used in this respect, to try to really take account of particular barriers in particular communities and particular parts of those communities, and how those community networks and public networks can be, if you like, given special opportunities, whether it's access to unlicensed spectrum or other ways in which we can build sustainability around those models of access. I think that's part of the picture that we're building here.
Okay. So, Jean, when ISOC is looking at these issues, like say community networks, you also have people like Mahavir Pun, for example, who was awarded on setting up a remote Wi-Fi networks in the hilly terrain in Nepal, and you also have been propagating this whole idea about low-cost, affordable internet exchange points. And I, being a co-founder of National Internet Exchange of India, so I understand challenges in terms of having a neutral, but still something which works well in that space. So what's been the experience there in terms of how do you, so one, obviously IXP, etc., can reduce the cost to some extent, but only so much. But beyond that, there are other challenges, and there are also challenges on the device side. So how do you handle that?
Sure. The device side is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah.
And for the record, I also help build communities, but I also help build the infrastructure. So I'm not just policy anymore. I've changed hats. The good news is we often have free equipment that we help donate. If you start to think about community networks and internet exchange points as very small joint venture JV projects from a very simple internet perspective, it's a startup. It's very simple. But it's a community-based startup, so you have to start with the people, training people, building capacity, building a community, and a neutral technical community. If you don't have that neutrality at the internet exchange point, you'll have nothing. It won't be sustainable, and people won't interconnect with you. But back to the equipment side, customs, taxes. I can't tell you how many times we've sent equipment to a country and it sits, and unfortunately I'm not going to use any examples of a specific country, but if I have free equipment and I'm sending you 2 very important pieces of equipment to help you run your local internet, and it sits in customs for 3 months, and there's a 50% duty on free equipment, you kept your internet in jail. If you're a regulator or policymaker, those customs policies have to change. In the Caribbean, we've had the easiest time. The regulators and policymakers help us, the equipment comes in, they get it out of jail, and it goes exactly where it needs to go. But if you have equipment coming into your country and you cannot deploy it, it's ridiculous. And it's I won't use the standards that are used and accepted around the world and the different marks of acceptance, those should be recognized. The US, Europe, Japan, Canada, Brazil, we've all gone through these massive, what are called homologation processes, where the standards are there, as well as UL for the electrical side. So it's not as if we're sending equipment that's going to blow up the minute you input it into the system. But you've got to not try and say you're going to retest the equipment. That takes months of time. And if you're someone trying to deploy a low-cost network and you can't get that equipment out, it's a non-starter. One other thing from the Internet Exchange Point side and or the community network side, you have to stop thinking that this is a massive infrastructure project when you start. It goes through phases. There's the startup phase, a more sophisticated phase, and then an even more sophisticated phase. We've worked through all those phases, from the community building to the neutrality perspective, and helping people get more funding in and cost base. There's a network in Oaxaca, Mexico, where people are paying $2 to $3 a month. Peter Bloom, who's here, has helped start that network. You're not looking at massive amounts of money for a very simple service. This is voice over IP, 2G network, where they were able to deploy a network because they talked to the government and got the licenses. So it's important, if you're going to scale, you've got to have that sustainability and stability of the licensing there with you, so that you're not illegal. We're not talking pirate networks, because if they are pirate, the big incumbents will try and shut them down because they see them as a threat. So the key thing is to think about who you have to talk to and what network. IEEE has a massive network of people. We have a massive network of humans around the world who've done this. So I think the key thing is that connecting the dots across the different projects and regions to see what hasn't worked and what has worked. Because the what hasn't worked is just as important as the what has worked.
Sure. Yeah. So, Samar, when you are looking at accessibility and affordability, so one obviously is challenges, like in any other developing country, you would have those challenges. But also looking at from cultural aspects of what type of challenges have you seen in terms of accessibility, especially, for example, for girls and women in these type of projects?
Yes, in fact, talking about gender in terms of accessibility, I can tell that some study made in different countries, like Tunisia, for example, shows that boys have more opportunities to access the internet than girls. I want to talk, for example, about my country. Men have access to public places more than women, in coffee shops, in schools, at work. Meanwhile, women are raising kids and having some more other responsibilities. So through my work with the Tawassul project, for example, in some regions in Tunisia, because we work especially in the rural areas, we are trying to empower kids and teach them how to use internet, and we are giving them opportunity that the government and the schools are not giving it to them. And you'll find more boys than girls attending the school. So yes, we have to think about the gender equality,
Okay.
yeah, in terms of accessibility of internet.
But when it happens in terms of gender equality, you are saying, are you also seeing examples where using internet itself, it has empowered the women?
Women?
Yeah, I mean, once they get access to the internet, so getting access to the internet itself was a challenge for them.
Yes.
The first phase. But once you facilitated that, what was the impact after that?
Yes, for example, in Tunisia, we are very interested by entrepreneurship and creating your own startup. So, for example, by giving internet access to women, you can find a lot of women that are doing homemade work and, for example, selling homemade products. So by giving them internet access, they can create their own website and have larger clients and can get more money than she used to get. Yes, it's very helpful.
So Chris, okay, before Chris, Adrian wants to have something, and after that,
I just quickly wanted to endorse and support what Samar said, and to add that I think that from our point of view at the Web Foundation, the gender framing of this is absolutely critical. We have a project of Women's Rights Online. One of the things that project has found in our research in the last year or so is that in the places where we looked, which were mainly urban developing country contexts, women were up to 50% less likely to be online than men. And in a way more important than that top line number, which is probably no surprise to most of us, women less likely to be doing certain things, such as applying for a job online or expressing a strong opinion online. Now, why is there that difference? And as we try to understand the reasons, at least the expressed reasons, talking to women in that survey, the first reason that they cite is cost, and the second is skills and a perceived lack of skills. I say perceived because men in the same communities arguably were not more skilled and yet didn't perceive that as so much of an obstacle, which may be something about more psychology than anything else. So we've got work going on cost together with things like the affordable access at work. The skills part as well, equally important that we're focused on that.
Thanks. So Chris, what's been your evaluation at this point of time? I know it's still work in progress, but especially on aspects of affordability and accessibility in different communities around the world.
So I think, thank you. I think that the examples that Jane gave is about Rhizomatica is an excellent example. It is, they're making a go of it on less than $3 US. To me, India, your country, is a good example. The typical data plan is $6 US or less. It's a country with 1.3 billion phone users and only 300 million internet users. So we have 1 billion people who have phones who are not currently internet users. And it's an enormous opportunity, but it highlights the challenge. We're talking about legacy phones, we're talking about feature phones, 2G technologies, web-based apps, not separate apps on operating systems. It's a very different world. And so understanding how we have to adapt policies to make sense for that is a lot of sense. And one of the key mechanisms I mentioned before is application-centric plans, where you buy an email plan or something that doesn't give you access to the whole internet, but gives you access to what you really need. The other thing that's quite interesting to me is Jane mentioned donated equipment, and we've talked about capacity building. An important part of it is recruiting volunteers. And sometimes some projects are called barefoot engineers. These are people who are going to maintain, you actually train the trainers who will get the people who are going to maintain the network. There are some great projects we've seen which go up beautifully, but 6 to 12 months later they're off. And forget just maintaining them, upgrades, new equipment, things that get out of support. It's just a constant problem. 2 other thoughts I'd leave you with. I want to just point out, if you want to see someone else who's actually built networks, Ezekiel Tari from Vanuatu and the Mewo Telecommunications Committee, we've invited 11 project groups to speak at our events. And if you're interested, Thursday at 10:40, we're actually going to have them tell their stories. And I think it's wonderful we have Tawasul here. That's an important part which I think is often missing. The last thing I will say is I have to apologize. I have to leave for another session, but my colleague Muge Haseke, who will join us and continue to speak for One World Connected. But thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you.
Thanks, Chris. In fact, when Chris was talking about the barefoot engineers, so in India there's a college called Barefoot College, and there's only one requirement for, there's one particular eligibility for admission into that, and that's you should have never gone to a formal education. That's the only qualification for admission into that college. So, okay, so maybe you can come over and switch the seats here. Now, can we have any other questions or comments on these issues or affordability and accessibility? And please be brief.
Yes, my question is, have somebody of you elaborated on the fact that if internet comes to countries like, I see it in Myanmar, where we also have a project, that internet means Facebook in this context, and how to deal with that?
Okay. So, I know of some examples where people have been polled. So people had internet access and people were polled to ask, do you use internet? And they said no. But at the same time when they were asked, do you use Facebook? They said yes. Do you use WhatsApp? They said yes. So there are different ways and means in which people may perceive this particular access. And it was not that their access was limited only to WhatsApp or Facebook. The access was full-blown, but these were the things that they were using. So they were more familiar with whether they were using WhatsApp or Facebook vis-a-vis some of the other services or the internet as such, as a name or a concept they did not have. Yeah, ma'am, you had something to.
Hello, I'm Gonala Astbrink from Women with Disabilities Australia. I'm glad you mentioned some examples of inclusion for people with disabilities, and they were excellent examples. We had 2 workshops yesterday, about disability and accessibility. And we talked about universal design. We also talked about the future when it comes to Internet of Things and the benefits that people with disability can derive from that. And really, the affordability comes into that. In now, there's assistive technologies for smart homes for people who have to have those type of applications to live independently. But with the mainstreaming of Internet of Things in smart homes, as long as you have interoperability, that's going to make a huge difference in bringing the prices down for people with disability. I just want to also make a comment about community networks. And obviously, infrastructure is vital, but also that people's perspective, the need capacity building to ensure that everyone in that community can gain benefit, and that certainly includes people with disability. And we've done some work with Pacific Island countries in that regard. So there is a lot of potential to bring on the 1 billion people with disability globally to ensure that we have good inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Noah, and I'm an ISOC Youth at IGF Fellow. My question is regarding affordability. How to get rid of the ISP's monopoly and encourage the ISP's privatization, and how then to get ensured that the competition between ISPs are in the favor of the users in terms of getting affordable access and with the best quality.
Okay. So let me just add these things to two things very quickly. Number one, in terms of affordability, you mentioned about accessible devices, etc., and services. There are, of course, standards, for example, WCAG 2.0 and others. And if people adopt those, they are not only useful for the so-called disabled people. Look at this way. If you are using a small screen, and if you have an option of increasing the font size, it helps everybody. If you are using any screen, and if you have an option of reversing the contrast, and if you are outside in the sunshine, it helps everybody. So there are things about universal design principles that if everybody uses, it's for greater benefit to everybody. You mentioned about the monopoly of ISP. So in most countries, I would say there's a competition there, but in many countries the competition may not be that robust. In India, for example, the internet services started traditionally with the one incumbent government company way back in 1995. In 98, the day the government announced the policy, I will actually file a petition against that in less than 24 hours after that. But then we got a much better policy. And within a year, we had a few hundred ISPs. Of course, many of them don't exist today because their business model was not very good. But there's a huge number of ISPs in the country even today. And I would say that's also been the experience elsewhere. But ultimately, when it comes to multiplicity of ISPs, this is something which the policy and makers and the regulators have a major role, that they need to look at internet, that even if it is only an incumbent offering these things, not only you have less choice of service providers, you also have less choice in terms of service plans for that matter. Because they may have only, let's say, 1 or 2 plans and take it or leave it. Whereas the moment you introduce competition, there's going to be focus on efficiency, there's going to be focus on developing different plans. Jane, what's been the experience there?
The experience, the question about the monopolies and bringing in some competition, it's just a fact that there are still some de facto duopolies, triopolies, maybe some monopolies in some countries. There's also a legacy mentality in both the regulatory and policy thinking in some places. It can change, and it has in many places, countries. One thing I would say is that people are unconnected, and if they're unconnected, certain business models and regulatory models are just not working, and funding models. So I'd say we need to start thinking about changing that policy regulatory model for a more inclusive, bottom-up, community-based, where people can come in and actually talk to the regulator, have their voices heard, participate in those hearings and the information coming in. Because if you're running a community network in a small, isolated area, your costs on the ground are so much more, the equipment getting in and bringing it in. We have a project in Tusheti, Georgia. It's a high mountain range, about 4,000 meters to 6,000 meters. the horses that were bringing in the towers fell off. One of the horses fell off the mountain, bringing in the equipment. Now the horse survived. We're happy about this, 'cause, but the equipment, of course, fell off the mountain. It's a time factor too. If there's a license to deploy a network and it's a 6-month license to get the network deployed, that's crazy, right? We're looking at different models that have to be accommodated for both geography, affordability, as Adrian was saying before, and the funding models. Universal service, with all due respect to some regulators and policymakers, is broken in most countries. The funds sit in these bank accounts for years, and no one can get them out, or it takes a year to extract the money to fund the projects. So let's talk to the banks, look at microfinance, new ways to finance these projects with a longer return, and ways that the regulator, I think Adrian mentioned this or Christopher earlier, it's not just the Ministry of Communications and the regulator. You've got to start talking to the Education Ministry that may have a vested interest, or the Ministry of Economics.
Health, maybe.
Absolutely. Health, absolutely. Yeah. Health, education, transportation, whatever it is where you can combine political interests. Because if there's a political interest as well, that's what happened in Mexico. The regulator said, we're not providing service in a socially marginalized area. We have social purpose licenses which are experimental. So it's working. The spectrum, there's no interference. Yeah. The project's been deployed. It can be scaled. Why not? I mean, we've got to take a chance right now because we've been doing this for 20 years. We keep talking about why people aren't connected. It's pretty logical.
Sure. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, please.
Have there been any examples? Oh, I'm Shannon from Hong Kong. I wanted to ask if there's been any examples of communities that have actually expressed opposition against technological penetration due to its inherent conflicts with maybe the local cultural or religious beliefs? And how have your projects taken into account the ethical considerations among stakeholder individuals that might not be in support of this innovation, in spite of your obviously virtuous intentions?
So, do you have any such examples where after a deployment, the local communities actually protested against this, let's say, the imposition of internet access in that particular area? The examples of that sort?
Yeah, actually there is one example. We have a case study based in Costa Rica. It was an e-government project. It was very interesting for the government actually when they, so what they were providing was the digital healthcare system across the country. And what they found out was that in Costa Rica, people were going to hospitals, waiting in lines to see the doctor and to make an appointment. And actually one of the, a couple of cases, they sued the government for changing the system where like you make the appointment online. Because for them, so these were like older adults, for them it was a social gathering, meeting point, waiting in the line when they go to a hospital to make an appointment, because that's where they were meeting and talking to each other, especially older people. And actually, they really didn't like that change. They really found it difficult, to make this online, to use the online system. And instead, they said they would prefer just waiting in the line, going there, like showing up at 8 a.m. in the morning and meeting with other people who are in their age and discussing about their health conditions and just meeting in general. Because when they were provided that system, so you basically go to hospital when it's your time to see the doctor, and you don't make that contact with other, people that maybe you used to. So this was very interesting. So again, like this was more of a top-down approach, and they thought, that will be accepted and really found useful for the entire community. But they had that kind of resistance from the certain groups of, communities in the society, which was very interesting.
Yeah. In some places, especially in patriarchy-oriented cultures, there have been resistance, especially for girls getting even a phone, forget about a smartphone, or using internet, because it is being seen as a tool of empowerment. So everybody realizes that, yes, it is a tool for empowerment for them. But then at times when they see people stepping out, doing other things, it disturbs the traditional power structures. it challenges them. And that's again a reaction from some of these scenarios. Yeah, Jane.
Just to quickly add, we've seen the same thing in some places, but also, this may surprise you, but in the United States and Canada and some tribal communities, First Nations in Canada, Native American in the United States, the elders in the villages and the towns have not really wanted the technology to come in, largely due to that the land is sacred to those communities, but there are a lot of youth who want to see connectivity for social dynamic purposes and economic purposes. So there's a new shift where children and the youth are talking to the elderly, and some of the elders are realizing, okay, we won't put this on this piece of sacred land, but we'll come up with a solution. And so it's good for education and other. So we're seeing it in different vectors, if you could say that.
So let's move on to the last segment of our session this time, which is about assurance. So when we're talking about assurance, it's about things like security, it's about privacy, it's about safety, reliability of the system, and everything else. I mean, this year itself, if you recall, we had a situation when Equifax happened. We had a situation when Yahoo acknowledged that they had a huge number of breaches, and of course, there was ransomware like WannaCry and Petya during the year. At the same time, this was also the year when we had a whole lot of other challenges in terms of privacy. We have fake news, many other things. These new, I mean, to me, being a slightly older hand at the IGF, one of the things, to me, one of the major new theme this year is the fake news overall. If I look at just the word cloud of differentiations, that's one thing which stands out separately for me. So what's been the type of situation in terms of when it comes to assurance, so security, privacy, reliability, those type of things. So what's been the experience from the field research? If you could briefly mention that, and then we'll go around.
What exactly?
Let's say, are people having any concerns around cybersecurity? Are people having any concerns around privacy? Are people having any concerns around reliability of the basic internet infrastructure itself? Are people having trust in using these services? What's been the field experience?
So I think inclusion, there are different steps in inclusion ladder when we kind of think about it overall. And so when you look at the unconnected communities, so these are up on the ladder. So the first things, what they do with the internet or what they consider is right or wrong, it doesn't come right away when you connect them. And most of the projects that we have in our project are the new communities, unconnected communities who just are introduced to the internet. So I think when you think about digital inclusion, there are different steps. So you can't just you should focus on one thing at a time. So privacy, I think, comes a little later for these communities. But you should, as a internet provider, I think you need to, consider all these at different levels at time.
Edward?
Well, I think this is a really central question. This is when Karen asked us at the start of the session to find a word for the internet in 10 years' time, and I said broken, question mark. It was this I had in mind, more so than even the affordability challenge, because as we heard before, even if you have the technological framework in place and you make access affordable, it is not yet clear that people will make the most use of that facility. So I guess here there are three components to the challenge. It seems to me, one is content, and we've talked a little bit about how content, in a number of ways, is less appropriate, less usable to citizens than we would all want it to be, whether that's in a kind of a local or specific context because of content not being the right language, those kind of issues, or much more at a macro level, all of the challenges that we see at the moment and in the last year or two of misinformation and hate speech and harassment. There was a great panel here yesterday that I sat in on digital civility, and I think there's a great concept there that needs a lot more mining and exploration and understanding that might provide a great framework for how we regard content and conduct online to be better organized. Secondly, there's a challenge, of course, of censorship. And the ways in which large parts of the internet are at different times for different people out of reach. I think Freedom House found that internet freedom has declined for the 6th consecutive year. 2/3 of all internet users now live in countries where criticism of government, military, ruling family is subject to censorship, and governments around the world shut down the internet more than 50 times in 2016 alone, according to Access Now. So many challenges around government action, which I guess in a way is becoming more nuanced and more sophisticated, shutting down for specific periods of time around an election or for specific communities or different language speakers, and that becomes all the more important that we tackle it. And then the third one is around our personal data, and if we don't understand, let alone control, how private companies are dealing with and monetizing our personal data, then we have a problem. And I think the data shows that most internet users don't feel fully aware of the types of personal information that is being collected about them, and most of us don't understand how companies are using it. So there's much work to be done there, and I guess the bottom line is that the personal data of each of us should be considered as much our personal property as the hair on our head. And if that is the case, if that is the understanding, then there has to be a way that we can overcome this challenge where our digital selves are currently split across different places, different companies that have collected different pieces on us over different times. If each and every one of those pieces were actually ours and were within some kind of repository that we could access, that we could control, and we could decide how we would allow access on a controlled basis, then we would be in a much better place. But I think just finally, I'm sorry to go on a little bit, just finally, these three pieces add up to a real threat to the web and the internet as a public good. And we argue for the internet as a basic human right, such as water is a basic human right. But of course it's clean water that is a basic human right. Dirty water is no good to anybody. In fact, it can really hurt you. And perhaps similarly, there is an internet that is fully understood as a public good that needs to be brought up to that true standard in order for us to really expect to get access to it for everybody and make that access really useful.
Okay. So in fact, today is 20th, and we are just 5 months and 5 days away from the 25th of May 2018 when the EU GDPR kicks in that sense. So you talk about data protection and that. So Jane, what's been the experience in terms of, are people having these things in terms of people should think about security and privacy by design at that level of when designing a particular project, or should it come as an afterthought and
that's a really good
bother
question.
about it later?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's usually an afterthought in some areas. With internet exchange points in the technical community, usually it's a thought, but they're just trying to get started. But the key thing is, one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about security is not to over-regulate in the name of security, because what we see people trying to do is regulators potentially and policymakers look at an internet exchange point as a monitoring facility.
Yeah.
They're not built for that. It's technical infrastructure. It's a switching platform. Traffic goes over the platform. It's not meant to spy. After Snowden, this is a question that comes up everywhere we go, and we often have to just answer it right away. If that's the decision of the government, fine, but don't try and impose certain technological difficulties on top of that architecture to make it harder. Same thing with border crossings. We're hearing a lot of remonopolization conversations in the name of security. So to the point that the young woman made about more liberalized infrastructure, more infrastructure, cheaper, usually. Cheaper, faster, better, hopefully. But if you start to remonopolize traffic going over borders, that's a problem in the name of security. So I think the key thing is no single point of failure, whether it's technical or human, and what that means is training, capacity development, and more. and that's it. I think I'll just stop there, but I think it's the single points of failure you don't want to encourage. And watching this new trend of saying that in the name of security, we're going to have only one company carry that traffic. It's tricky.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Samar, what's been the experience in your side project in Tunisia? Are people concerned about online privacy and security, reliability, resilience of the system, these things?
Yes, thank you, Deepak. That's a good question. In fact, the weird thing with our case is that they are really trusting the internet and they are enjoying it when they get the access. They're not really caring that much about their privacy, and it's not good, especially for the kids. So that's why, even though we want to create a new community-oriented mindset where social connection and exchange atmosphere across generations are key values, but we are organizing workshops for the parents to make them aware about the security of the cybersecurity, and by making parents aware of about how to prevent themselves from getting hacked, for example, and how to protect their personal data and control their kids, the internet access of their kids. I'm always talking about my experience through Tawasul, but in general, I show that people really have to be aware about how to protect your personal data because it's really dangerous.
I think the challenge nowadays is that usually it is the adults who go to the children about when they have a challenge in terms of internet access, whether with a device or a service. So children know better how to control the parents' access to internet rather than the other way. So at this point of time, I would like to invite any other questions or comments from participants here. Anybody has any questions or comments? Yeah, please.
So on Monday, Windsurf said his greatest fear is that the internet will be diverted in different parts. So is there one idea of how to deal with a fragmented internet, or is it even possible in 10 years to give people the internet, or do we have to figure out which part of the internet will we give to the people?
I think this is what Adrian had mentioned right in the beginning, broken with a question mark, and Jane also just mentioned in terms of potential fragmentation of internet. If everybody wants to localize everything, so local context is fine, local language is fine, local relevance is fine, and local community involvement in building infrastructure and services is also fine. But at the same time, if we try to do the physical localization of the internet infrastructure in terms of the data storage and data flow, etc., then the fact is that it will start breaking. And the moment it starts breaking, it is no more the internet. It will become perhaps a multitude of different networks working in different places, at times even without any interoperability across them. And it is not about the technical interoperability. It's basically about the interoperability of the data itself being able to go from one place to another place. So Jane, would you like to react to this?
Yeah, and actually I was in that session as well, and it was a great session on various aspects. The technical architecture wasn't designed from a networking perspective to go country to country. It goes network to network, and the protocols are not political. And I think the key thing that many people would say in IEEE and in the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Architecture Board, don't politicize the protocols and the standards and the architecture. However, governments are political, so they're looking at solutions. So we really have to strongly encourage at the technical community perspective the integrity of the technical architecture and how that works versus politicizing standards to change the way architecture is. But the balkanization or the fragmentation is a real potential. We have a futures report that came out this summer, September, sorry. And this was one of the key things that we found is that there is this serious, and Karen Rose, who's a former colleague from the Internet Society, is here, and she worked on that report for years, I think a year at least. But we surveyed over 3,000 people at that time, I think more, maybe 10,000, but lots of data came in, and this was a huge concern for people. So the question is, are we going to find little pieces of IP-based infrastructure, or are we going to have something else? I hope that people don't politicize the technical architecture more.
Yeah, I think at the same time we should also appreciate that we all need to work with the government. We need to understand the perspective of the policymakers also, and provide suitable solutions which may not be only technical. Part of that could be policy, part of that could be technical, in terms of addressing their real needs rather than just the perceived potential challenges that they at times think about. So Adrian.
I just wanted to add one thought on this, maybe around the creation of content, because it seems to me that, I mean, the World Wide Web Foundation that I lead was founded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who created the web and built the web, as people know, as a sort of a flat structure on top of the existing flat structure of the internet. And you know, he has always said that the first reason for trying to create that permissionless space was so that enterprise and creativity could thrive, and that was the only way it would thrive. And so maybe another part of the answer to this question about how do we ensure that the internet is maintained as that open, public, permissionless space is to really look for ways to drive content creation. You know, the web was meant to be a network of creators and collaborators, not just consumers. And indeed it has been, and arguably still is to some extent, but not in the way it was a few years ago, perhaps. And that's why things like, to take a topical and perhaps controversial point, net neutrality are so important, because maintaining that permissionless space is the way in which the next Twitter or the next great idea will surface. And hopefully, you know, that not just the stuff that works globally and becomes the sort of the mega apps that many of us use, but are sort of generic for everybody, but also the kind of applications and the kind of uses of the website that are just as impactful and useful, but for particular communities. You know, I sat a few weeks ago with a group of 200 young women and girls who were coding in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, and the creativity and the energy and the dynamic kind of determination in that room was tangible. And I have no doubt that those women and many others like them, and men too around the world, will create the reasons for the internet to continue to have value, as long as we don't put obstacles in their way, including some of the kind of things that are on the agenda in some capitals at the moment.
In fact, when Windsurf was with us on Sunday at our Day Zero event, two of the things that he did mention was these. One was that, on one hand, yes, we need to continue to do this permissionless innovation, but at the same time also have very strong deterrence to do away with the harm, because yes, there are some people who are doing certain level of harm, and there may be others. So what is a high level of deterrence which is demonstrable and enforceable, and that's something we should do. The second thing is, of course, in terms of, as you mentioned, people are not just consumers, and which is absolutely right, because internet is as a ecosystem enables us to become prosumers, as Alvin Toffler had mentioned in his book Future Shock in the early 70s. So that's the concept that we are looking at right now again, that people are not only consuming content, people are also producing content, including original content, whether it's a picture, whether it's a video, whether you're writing something, you're sending a message or something like that. So is there any other comment or question? Otherwise, I'll hand it over to Karen for the wrap-up. Yeah, Ishak, yeah, please.
Actually, I wanted just to give a comment concerning the kids that we are giving them workshops. Some of them, they are actually aware about the privacy and some security stuff. We once had a workshop, and we were asking them to connect, because we are going to use an online tool, and they need to connect through Facebook or Google account. So, some of them asked us to just look there. They're going to write their passwords, and then before even getting out from the room, they were insistent on disconnecting from their account. So we just knew that they are actually aware about the privacy and security stuff. So we are now focusing on this, and we wanted to focus on the privacy and the security on the internet on the parents as well, because we want them to feel secure when their kids are using tablets and they are connecting on the internet. So actually,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Karen.
Well, I think that was a really great dialogue, and I thank all the panelists. So in conclusion, we wanted to take a few minutes just to reflect quickly on the panel and ask first to our participants, we'll go to the audience first, if you have one takeaway from the session today, what is it? Just speak up.
Thank you. My name is Tatom Figwe from Internet Society, Untitled Chapter. Mine is more of a comment in regard to the topics that have been discussed today. So, firstly, when we're talking about digital inclusion for communities, for me, I'd say access, obviously, is the first thing that comes into mind, but also there's the issue of local language, as one of the speakers has also spoken about, because when we look globally in terms of the use of the language on the internet, we find that the two most languages, they represent close to 40 to 45% of internet users. So in developing regions like Africa, the Global South, you find that access is the most important, and then the issues of security and safety, then they follow after. And then furthermore, I think in order to actually enable this digital inclusivity, a focus needs to actually take place, especially in regard to young people and men and women, because when you look at the education system, you find that teachers are pretty uncomfortable learning about the internet along with learners. But when you go to a household environment, you are able to actually find a young child teaching their parents in terms of how to use the internet. So I think it is more of a strategic way of ensuring that there is ultimately that digital inclusion and transformation in communities. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone have a key takeaway? Please.
Digital inclusion is not only about getting connected and having an email address or social media accounts. It's about how to shape your life using internet and to be empowered.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share? Key takeaway? So we'll go to we'll ask our panelists. Jane.
It's the content issue, actually. It was coming into my mind that, as Adrian was saying, if people don't see themselves in what they're using and see their own culture, they're not going to use the internet as much and create. I think it's the creative. I can't take credit for this, but it was Karen again. I think it's you go from being a user to a consumer to a creator. And that was a mantra that was embedded when I first started the Internet Society, and it still matters.
Tamar?
Yes, I share the same point of view as Jane, and I think that we should start using the internet with the appropriate way, because it's not only about doing some researches and getting connected to social media, and that's it. Thank you.
Adrian?
I agree with what my fellow panelists has already said. And I think one other takeout. I was just listening to what you were saying about the example of people in a particular community who have sort of rejected or at least initially rejected some of the connectivity on offer because it took away an opportunity and a habit that people had of social interaction, of standing in line to make an appointment. When you were saying that, actually, I was realizing this is not a sort of a challenge of one place. It's a challenge of everywhere. My own doctor's surgery in rural Oxfordshire in England. I went in there a few weeks ago, and now, of course, everybody just taps a little thing on the screen and sits down instead of going up to the desk and saying, "Morning, I'm coming in for the 8 o'clock. Is Dr. So-and-so there?" So I guess the takeout from that is that number one, there are societal challenges from this that we should recognize as such, and as I know we all do, recognize that not all of this is going to be fixed by technical or technological approaches alone by any means, and also that these are challenges that affect us all wherever we are in the world. They're not a problem of a particular part of the world, they're for us all.
Yeah, so related to that, my takeaway would be including the communities into the innovative models just at the beginning and asking them, you know, what their needs are. So over 100 project case studies that we have conducted, actually 70% of the projects are either failed or are not sustainable. And the reason for that is, you know, some of them are because not bottom-up projects. So when it's more like top-down, they come from the innovators or donors or, you know, international organizations. They have certain intentions, but it doesn't necessarily address the real needs of the communities. So one of which actually comes specifically in the health sector, which is very complicated and complex, and healthcare providers don't see the need, for instance. For them, it's a burden, you know, when you introduce a technology in a hospital and to healthcare providers, when you say, okay, this is what you need to do right now for all this work that you have been doing in the past. So it's really important to make them a part of this, you know, innovative project at the beginning and explain them how introducing technology might help them at the beginning, so that, you know, you will not kind of face those kind of challenges along the way.
Well, thank you. I think we're at our time, and there's probably another session coming right behind us. So I want to thank our panelists, and more so thank our audience and our participants and folks online. Great discussion. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you. No, I have a pen. My bag is over there, so. Did I give him my card? Yes, you did, yeah. So let's share notes later. I'll share. Yeah.
Out 800 projects, and we wrote about 100 case studies around the world. And so on the demand side, we have projects in education, health, financial inclusion, literacy, human empowerment, agriculture, and e-government. And on the supply side, we have projects in community networks and infrastructure, building infrastructure. And so we write short, like 4 or 5 pages of case studies. Some of which you can find. We have a booth if you have some, you know, time today. Please come to our booth. We have some brochures, and we can show you some of. We are showcasing all of our projects. We have a screen where we show some of our projects, and you can also provide me some more detailed information. It's you know where all the booths are. We are at the very back of the booth. The last is basically.
What was the name again?
One World Connected.
One World Connected.
Yeah, it's like giant world map. Yeah. What is your project, or how is your project?
My project, which we started 6 months ago, the first thing was to find a definition of what digital participation and women need.
Yeah.
But we are focused on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, accessibility. Because we are media broadcaster and we are doing a media project. And then addressing affordability, infrastructure, media, but what's
It's better to see it.
systems, information policy, the content side, also social,
Right, left.
Either side, wherever you feel comfortable.
So many examples for you in
Yeah,
the social and cultural dimension, but there are also papers that I can share with you, and that more conceptual, like what digital inclusion is and how it kind of proceeds. So there
You don't have a card, or?
I actually no, I just realized that I have a big one.
Hi, Irina. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, I can definitely.
Dobro utro.
I'm actually going back to booth right now.
I see.
Yeah, if you have time, please stop by. We also will be presenting our research tomorrow.
Sorry, pardon. Hello. Yes, wherever you feel most comfortable. Oh, you're such a sweetheart. I owe you a drink.
Knock it out.
That's right. Oh, Marta. Welcome. Buenos dias. Idia, do you want to sit over on this side or something, or so we can have a little more balance? Or should I don't know where I should sit, but okay. Here.
Slightly better.
I hope you're okay, Idia.
Yeah,
You okay?
Okay.
Do I have enough battery charge? I think.